Kirtland Temple, I'm getting texts, bombarded, all kinds of people. What's going on, Kirtland? And it's not just the temple, right?
Right. So the Community of Christ, and the news article at the Desert News explains it pretty well. Community of Christ has owned the Kirtland Temple for a long time. In fact, I think it was Joseph Smith III who bought it for $150 in the 1860s
Wow.
with a quit claim deed, and then donated it to their church. But so they've owned it all this time. The church just announced they paid $192.5 million for the Kirtland Temple, along with some of the facilities in Nauvoo.
Who did this money go to?
Community of Christ.
Oh my goodness. So we're talking about Kirtland, Ohio. Sorry, Kirtland Temple.
Kirtland, Ohio.
Go ahead.
Kirtland, the temple, the first temple that Joseph Smith built is in
Yes.
Kirtland, Ohio. And the Community of Christ, as I said, owned it ever since Joseph Smith III, Joseph's son, purchased it for $150. And then that was in the 1860s. So they've owned it ever since. They conducted tours and so on. A couple of years ago, I was told that the church is going to buy it, and it's been in negotiations for a while, for a long time actually. But finally today they announced it, which is awesome. Hopefully it's awesome. And the reason I say hopefully is because we'll see how the tours are conducted now. They'll probably be quite different from the way they were under Community Christ.
Right.
But they also purchased in Nauvoo the Smith family homestead, the mansion house, and the red brick store. If you've been to Nauvoo, you know those are kind of at the end of Water Street down that towards the river.
Yeah.
And that's especially interesting because we like to say that the Smith family homestead is where there's a cemetery where Joseph and Hiram and Emma are buried. And it turns out that's actually an ancient burial site for the Hopewell Indians. And they know that because they were digging a water line, utility line between the buildings, and they started churning up all these bones and artifacts, pottery and stuff. And some of those have been on display in the bottom of the red brick store. If you ask permission, you can go look at them. My suspicion is now that the church bought it, you won't have access to that stuff anymore. Kirtland Temple was where the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were involved. That's where the priesthood keys were restored.
Right.
It's maybe one of the most historic sites in the whole history of the church. It's the Kirtland Temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Community of Christ doesn't have the resources to maintain it as well as it could be maintained, for example. And then, next to it or near, kind of across the street down a ways, is the Joseph Smith homestead, which is a home that Joseph owned. And that was dedicated last summer by Elder Bednar. I actually went on a tour of that after the church first bought it, and they were trying to figure out what part of the house was original, what wasn't, and all that. That was several years ago. And they now they've restored it, been dedicated. They have the whole kind of the Kirtland era village there that's been restored. Now having the Kirtland Temple will just kind of complete that whole complex. One possibility is that they'll restore the print shop that was behind the Kirtland
That
Temple,
would
which
be
I hope
neat.
they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Well, I mean, not only being the first temple built by the pioneers, when I say Nauvoo is just as historical, it is true that Kirtland is where many miracles happened. That's where
Yeah.
almost like the day of Pentecost for the
Mhm.
church. That's the church's in this dispensation's day of Pentecost, where angels were seen hovering above the temple. People spoke in tongues, and and then for like weeks, right? There
Yeah.
were people going around like just blessing each other and filling the Holy
Yeah.
Ghost. It
Yeah.
was a miraculous time.
Yeah, it was. And it's important for lots of historical reasons. Hopefully the tours will continue and be maybe even better than they have been. I mean, I've been through there several times myself, and it's just an awesome thing to have. Community of Christ is
Absolutely.
awesome. They just don't believe in the temple the way that we do. And so to them, it was more of a meeting house. It wasn't a place for any sacred rituals and
Yeah.
things. So we'll see how that turns out. The ones in Nauvoo, I'm especially interested in, partly because the the RLDS / Community of Christ had a different approach to telling church history than our church does out there. some years ago, I was out there doing a TV interview in the print shop, the John Taylor Times and Seasons print shop out there, and I was explaining the history of the Times and Seasons and the Nauvoo Neighbor and the Wasp. And the missionaries there had never heard of the Wasp, which was an early Nauvoo newspaper.
Right, right.
Whereas down the street at the Community of Christ, you can purchase a replica of the Wasp. In fact, I have one. I don't know if I have it here, but it's a full-size replica, the whole thing. And the reason the missionaries never talk about the Wasp, even though the Wasp was very important in church history. And it's because William Smith was the publisher and he was cantankerous, and there were things published in there that I guess the church didn't approve of. And one guy wrote to Joseph Smith and said, "You shouldn't have the Wasp, it reflects badly on you." So Joseph fired his brother, William Smith, put John Taylor in charge, and they renamed it the Nauvoo Neighbor. So you go from the Wasp with the sting, because he was writing these editorials attacking everybody, to the Nauvoo Neighbor. So now when you go to the church's facilities in Nauvoo, they only talk about the Nauvoo Neighbor. They never mention the Wasp. Whereas Community of Christ not only mentions the Wasp, but sells, reprints of it for anybody who wants it. So I suspect it's just, again, it gets back to this question of historical authenticity. Is the church going to acknowledge the Wasp and that was part of the history, or are they going to pretend it never existed?
Right.
And so that'll be interesting to see. The Nauvoo house, of course, and the Mansion House, well, they all have the red brick store. They all have important aspects of church history that took place there. So it'll be interesting to see how that's presented and taught.
What do you think this is going to do financially for the Community of Christ?
Well, I assume it's going to set them up, at least it'll fund all their pensions and their other financial needs.
$193 million. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah. I have no idea anything about their financials.
Right.
So
they're now they've kind of, I know they used to be the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
They now have women pastors. They have a woman prophet now. They do have apostles, some sort of apostleship. But as far as a lot of the things that they used to believe, they've kind of completely overhauled a lot of that. I know that.
Yeah. I mean, I just spoke to a group the other night, primarily Community of Christ, and they're fantastic. I mean, they love the Book of Mormon, at least the group that I talk with. And
yeah, but I thought they kind of denounced the Book of Mormon, or not denounced it, but they don't, not part of their canon anymore.
Well, there's some misunderstandings about all that. And the other misunderstanding is there's lots of different factions. If you go out to Independence Ever, you drive around, there's even a Cumorah branch.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier, that there's several different
groups that broke off.
Right.
And I've attended, one or two of their meetings before, and the people are fantastic. Some of them totally are Heartlanders, some of them are totally Mazo guys, just like in our church. But the couple ways to look at it is they never banned blacks from the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
They never practiced polygamy. So in some respects, our church has kind of reverted back to theirs. They have had women ordained to the priesthood and some other things that we haven't done, but it's very difficult to be judgmental. Back in the early 1900s, the president of their church was Joseph Smith III, and the president of our church was Joseph F. Smith. They were cousins, and they had ongoing correspondence back and forth, and even debates, and basically arguments back and forth about polygamy and other things.
Yeah. Well, I know the church, even the early prophets and brethren, have always kind of had this kindred spirit for they would have, like, there would be leaders come to Utah and visit them, and the other way around occasionally.
Oh, they're related.
Right.
Community of Christ, or the Reorganized Church.
It was a family reunion for many years.
Well, but there's a lot of animosity too. In fact,
right,
because the Reorganized Church sent missionaries to Utah, and one report I saw they converted 5,000 Utah Mormons to go back to Missouri. So, it kind of went back and forth that way too. But I see this as another way of building bridges. I think it's going to be great for the relationships between the two groups.
Mm-hmm.
The, we'll see how what happens. I just hope the church history department sticks with authentic history and not some of the what do you call I don't want to say whitewashing, but it is basically whitewashing of some of the history, because it's far more interesting to understand Nauvoo if you're familiar with the WASP and how the connections between the WASP and the Times and Seasons when Joseph Smith was the nominal editor, when William Smith was really doing the editing, and W. Phelps. There's a lot of interesting history there that the church has just kind of ignored in Nauvoo up until the present. So hopefully that gets resolved.
Yeah.
And like we did an interview recently about these articles in the Liahona where the football moved down the field, but they fumbled it, right? In this case, I think this is moving the football down the field. Let's hope there's no fumbling going on.
I'm so tired. I'm exhausted. I can't even think.
Sorry,
I've
we've
been
had a
up
long
since,
day.
well, I taught seminary early this morning too. And then I interviewed Ben McClintock. I did 2 interviews with you. I spent an hour with Ben before I even got on with you. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got to be tired.
Did you share anything while we were talking yet? Did you share the article? Yeah, you did.
No, I haven't.
Oh.
I didn't share it on. Do you want me to pull it up?
If you want, just real quick.
Okay, I'll just show it.
So you guys can, if you want to link, there's an interesting article in the Deseret News, right?
Yeah, the Deseret News did a good article on it. And the article includes the official announcement. Here's a picture of the Kirtland Temple. And the article explains it. And then there's a joint statement from the Community of Christ and the Church, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that it has some Q&A in it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Hey, great. It's been fun being with you.
Yeah. You have a good one.